It's a great honor to be with all of you this morning, and thank you again for coming out today. You're probably wondering why a talk on science near-death experiences in the Shroud of Turin. Because, essentially, there's been a really ugly rumor going around, very inaccurate, that somehow science and faith are contradictory. Science and faith can't be reconciled with one another, and the Pew survey tells us that this is going to affect fully 20% of our Catholic youth, not just Catholics, but from every religion around the world. It's going to affect 20% of them. They're going to move from their Catholic faith to no religion at all, classified as a nun in the Pew survey. And so I think it's essential to start giving our students the information that they need to see that science and faith are not in any way contradictory. It's exactly the opposite. Today's science is pointing to faith, is pointing to God, is pointing to the soul, is pointing to Jesus in unexpected and truly probative, convincing ways. Now, I have a free curriculum on this. You can get it. It's called 7 Essential Modules. You can get it at crediblecatholic.com. Crediblecatholic.com. For the moment, though, I'm going to just present 2 themes on where science and faith, science and God, science and the soul, science and Jesus are converging very remarkably in the 21st century. There are many other areas. There's the Borda-Vilenkin and Guth proof that shows a creation of the universe. There's also entropy evidence and fine-tuning that shows the intelligence behind that. Can't do that today. There's also a series of contemporary, scientifically validated miracles. Can't do that today. But what we can do is look at these near-death experiences and also look at the Shroud of Turin, and you'll see not only how this affects your faith, but how it can really affect and potentially support the faith of young people who are truly being affected by the media, and especially social media. Remember that website, crediblecatholic.com, and just download those 7 essential modules. It's all free, all free. Let's go to the second area, which I think is very probative, very convincing for our young people, and that is the Shroud of Turin. Probably most of you know that the Shroud of Turin was a burial cloth that sort of came to light in the mid-14th century, in the 1300s. Geoffroy de Charnay discovered or just announced, I have the burial cloth of Jesus. Everybody said, all right, we believe you. But of course, later on, we have evidence after evidence, we'll be talking about in just a moment, that this is very, very probably the burial cloth of Jesus. But for the time being, the shroud seems to have disappeared for a little bit. In fact, for 1,300 years, it seems to have disappeared, though we have signs of where it was, and I'll talk about them in a moment. But the main thing is the cloth is 14 feet long. And on that cloth, there are bloodstains, literally hundreds of bloodstains. And amidst the bloodstains is an image. And if you look at that third, the sepia-colored slide there, you can see it doesn't look like much at first. But then if you go back to the previous slide, the black and white, you can see that what's imprinted on this linen cloth, which is a non-photographically sensitive cloth. What's imprinted on this cloth is a perfect photographic negative image. And it's not just a perfect photographic negative image, it's a perfect three-dimensional photographic negative image. And this is really important because this cloth gives us not only a relic of Jesus' passion, but a relic of Jesus' resurrection. More on that in a moment. The point here, though, is you look at this, the bloodstains are obvious, the image is obvious, the face is absolutely remarkable, as we'll see, and it has many, many clues to the identity of Jesus on that, including his resurrection. Okay, so what happened? We have been amassing data since 1872, when Secundo Pia took the first set of photographs and discovered it was a perfect photographic negative image on a non-photographically sensitive linen cloth. And since that time, it has been the subject of more scientific investigation than any other relic in history. For my point right now, I'm just going to go through, rather than go through the history of all this, what I want to do is just get to the facts that really are probative and convincing for our kids. The first thing is, once we had all that scientific data going, they wanted to do a carbon dating. In 1978, in the Shroud of Turin research project, it was determined that they should take samples from 7 different parts of the cloth, and they were to do materials testing, and they were also to do thermochemical testing prior to removing those samples to make sure that they were part of the original linen cloth. Why were they so concerned about this? Because the shroud was caught in a fire in 1458 called the Fire of Chambray. And in that fire, some molten metal had dropped through the shroud. You can see that on the pictures there, had dropped through the places on the shroud. And so some sisters, right after the fire, actually sewed up those little holes and then put a backing cloth on it and sewed that into the cloth. But they used fibers, they used threads, they used cloths that actually came from the 15th century, after 1458. So it was really, essential to make sure that this was part of the linen cloth. In 1988, a carbon dating was done, but it didn't follow any of the protocols from the 1978 Stirp investigation. As a matter of fact, 1 sample only was taken from the cloth, only 1. And that 1 sample was taken from a very controversial corner of the shroud, and that controversial corner was one of the places where the shroud had molten metal that had gone through, where the sisters had actually sewn in fabric into the cloth. And when this occurred, they took that 1 sample from that 1 place, cut it into 3 parts, and sent those 3 parts to 3 labs, and lo and behold, the carbon dating said that the Shroud of Turin came from the 15th century. Well, when I read that result in 1988, just being a very scientifically interested student, I thought, that's it. I was so sure that this was an authentic relic of Jesus, and now it's been confirmed it comes from the 15th century. I couldn't even imagine that someone would want to, as it were, take a fraudulent sample, and I'm not saying that they did this intentionally, but somehow a sample got taken that was not very good. But to make a very long story short, what happened was several chemists, thermal chemists, physicists, and historians actually took fibrils from the 1978 Stirp investigation. And what they did was they took sticky tapes, right? And they put those sticky tapes over every square centimeter of that cloth. So they had fibrils and fibers from every single part of that cloth. And then they examined the exact spot in that controversial corner where the sample was taken for the carbon dating. And they matched it to the sticky fibers from 1978, from the 1978 Stirp investigation. And lo and behold, what did they discover? Embedded in that area is a huge amount of cotton. Remember, what is the rest of the shroud made of? Linen from flax. Not cotton. Chemically very different. Thermochemically very different. So of course, they find all these cotton fibers in there, and the more they look at it, they also see that the sisters had dyed the cotton, right, with a gum dye mordant that only came into Europe in the 13th century. And of course, even the adhesive had only been in Europe since the 13th century. And so what they ruled is that this sample was completely invalid. Let me have someone read you the results of Dr. Ray Rogers after he completed the chemical analysis of the area from which the sample was taken. He, by the way, was the editor for years of the peer-reviewed journal Thermochemica. And here is his conclusion, his finding.
There we go. The combined evidence from chemical kinetics, analytical chemistry, cotton content, and pyrolysis mass spectrometry prove that the material from the radiocarbon area of the shroud is significantly different from that of the main cloth. The radiocarbon sample was thus not part of the original cloth and is invalid for determining the age of the shroud.
Boy, when I heard that, I went, wow, I was right all along. And of course, all of a sudden, a huge proliferation of scientific dating tests came out of this. Now, I'm just going to go through this really rapidly. If you want an explanation of all this, you could go to either magicenter.com or you could go to crediblecatholic.com and you could get a lot better explanation. I'm just going to go through it with you. Dr. Giulio Fanti and Dr. Ray Rogers suddenly then began a whole new set of dating tests. The first one was done by Dr. Ray Rogers, the guy you just heard from, and he developed a vanillin test that showed that the shroud probably originated in the 1st century. Then Giulio Fanti and his teams in 6 different labs throughout Italy did 2 additional tests from spectroscopy. The first one was a Fourier transformed infrared spectroscopy, and the second one was a Raman laser spectroscopy, and that, of course, excites different molecules that decay over time within a linen cloth, and they can measure that and then index it across other cloths. And then Giulio Fanti complemented this with a mechanical compressibility and tension test. After all 4 of those tests were done, the conclusion was and is that the shroud originated around 50 AD, plus or minus 150 years, with a 95% confidence level. I don't think the carbon dating was valid. But there's even more, and I'll just finish it up very quickly. If we take a look at the external tests that were actually done as well, we'll see that there are 3 other external dating ways of dating it. The first is there's a series of pollen fossils that are embedded in the cloth. And those pollen fossils that were originally categorized by a great Swiss criminologist, the #1, if you can say this, pollen fossil expert in the world, Dr. Max Frey, he basically categorized the following as he examined the cloth. #1, there are many pollen fossils that are indigenous to Jerusalem and northern Judea that are embedded in the cloth. In fact, the most number of pollen fossils in the cloth come from Jerusalem and northern Judea. And 4 of those pollen fossils, have never been found anywhere else in the entire world except Jerusalem and northern Judea. Very interesting. The second greatest number of pollen fossils comes from Edessa, Turkey. And we know, we're quite sure that the shrouds did show up in Edessa, Turkey, starting in the late 300s. And the reason we're quite sure of that is because the entire iconography of Jesus in the West, which used to be a very Roman Jesus, very clean-shaven, right, etc., smooth, rounded face, that iconography suddenly stops. And right there in Edessa, Turkey, the iconography of the West turns into a whole new kind of iconography. Jesus with a beard, Jesus with a long face, Jesus with long hair, Jesus with all kinds of interesting marks only to be found on the Shroud of Turin, like the square above his nose from the beating that he had received, and of course all of the lumps and so forth that he has on his face from the beating, etc. All of that begin to show up in what's called the Mendelian, right, in the 300s. And as this is occurring, of course, we can match that with the pollen fossils that Max Frey has categorized. And finally, the next number is from Constantinople, so we know it goes up to Constantinople. Pollen fossils indigenous to that area are there. We know that Geoffroy de Charnay, who's the one who presented the shroud in Liry, France in the 1300s, we We know he was related to some crusaders, some heads of the fourth and last crusade, that he was related to them 4 centuries back, and that they very likely had taken the shroud from the Church of St. Mary's and brought it with them, during the Muslim invasions and during, the Christian pillaging. I shouldn't say this, but it's true. The Catholic pillaging of Byzantium, and of course, they bring it up to Liry, France, and then we have a very good provenance for that cloth afterwards. Every single thing we suspected is validated by those pollen fossils. Number 2, there are coins on the man's eyes. Those coins, Roman leptons, they were put on the man's eyes because sometimes during rigor mortis, or sometimes, the eyes, just prior to rigor mortis would pop open. And so they didn't want, the eyes to pop open. So they put coins on the eyes of the man. And of course, the image, as we shall see, the image of those coins shows up very, very clearly on the shroud. So it not only is a picture of the man, it's not just a picture of the outside of his body, it's not just a picture of the inside of his body on this non-photographically sensitive linen cloth, it actually has a picture of those coins on the man's eyes. And where do those coins, those Roman leptons, come from? They come from a minting of Roman leptons in 29 AD by Pontius Pilate in Jerusalem. I kid you not. There are 4 enigmas on those coins. And those 4 enigmas show up on only 1 minting of Roman leptons ever in all of the museums of Roman coins in the world. And it comes from Jerusalem in that minting by Pontius Pilate. How can we be so sure that the images are correct? Robert Herelicht, Alan Wanger, all kinds of other guys have, of course, done very, very precise digital overlay studies. And I'm just going to have Joe read that quotation from Wanger and Herelicht that you can hear. Oh, I'm sorry. In that case, I will skip it altogether, but I'll just tell you that digital overlay is absolutely precise. There is no question that these coins came from that minting. Did a really sly medieval forger go ahead and do this? Did a really sly medieval forger say, I'm going to get those enigmatic coins that only occurred in a minting of Pontius Pilate in 29 AD? That'll really fool everybody. Not, of course. Enough said. Let's take a look at the third, extrinsic piece of evidence. The third piece of evidence comes from the Sudarium of Oviedo, or what is also known as the face cloth of Jesus, that is stored in the Cathedral of Oviedo and has been stored in the Cathedral of Oviedo since the late 600s. So since the 7th century AD, and we know that this face cloth was reported to be the face cloth of Jesus. Now, a lot of people, of course, doubted that until very recently. And the reason that no one doubts that anymore is because the same pollen fossils are embedded in that face cloth that are embedded, the ones that are indigenous to Jerusalem, to northern Judea, to Edessa, are there embedded in the face cloth of Oviedo as well. Now, the face cloth of Oviedo doesn't have an image on it, but it has 124 blood stains, very unusual blood stains from a very unusual crucifixion of Jesus. Why is Jesus' crucifixion so unusual? It's unusual first because, of course, Jesus was crowned with thorns. Other criminals were never crowned with thorns. So the key point is both images, the face cloth of Oviedo and the Shroud of Turin, the man was clearly crowned with thorns. And we can see the beating marks, et cetera, from this unusual crucifixion. What was a face cloth? A face cloth was used to transport a body that was in, exceedingly macabre condition. right? So when the person is beaten up in that way and they're tortured to death, fluids are going to come from their mouth and their nose during the time that, say, the body's transported from the cross over to the tomb. So out of decency and respect for the person, the face cloth is taken. And the face cloth is a cloth that goes all the way around the head, over the top of the head, and it goes down to the nape of the neck, and it's tied in front. And that face cloth then is used, but when the body reaches the tomb, the face cloth is removed. And the face cloth is put in a place by itself, and then the body is put into the burial shroud. You might recall from John's gospel this very passage, right? When Peter and John get to the tomb, they look inside and they see the burial shroud, and then rolled over in a place by itself, they see the face cloth. Now, here is the upshot. This is really important. There are 124 highly unusual, highly non-symmetrical bloodstains from an unusual crucifixion, a crowning with thorns that would have taken place with Jesus Christ on both cloths. The Shroud of Turin's bloodstains and the face cloth of Oviedo's bloodstains are identical in digital overlay. Do you know the odds of getting those 124 unusual bloodstains perfectly correct, a perfect match by pure chance? Astronomical. There's only one way you're gonna do it. Those two cloths had to touch the same face. Now here's the kicker. The face cloth of Oviedo has a provenance. A provenance means a historical, documented journey through bishops and reliable people going back to the 600s. Now you tell me how that medieval forger was able to produce those 124 bloodstains perfectly. You tell me how that could have touched the same face when we know that the face cloth of Oviedo goes back to 600, and very probably, because it has pollen fossils that go right back to Jerusalem, it comes from the same place that the Shroud of Turin did, and that is where the most number of pollen fossils are, Jerusalem and northern Judea. The very same place. Goes back to 600 AD or before, we got the message. The shroud is very probably from Jerusalem, very probably from the 1st century, very probably around 50 AD, exactly as the 4 dating tests have established. And so I think it is very reliable for us to say this came from Jerusalem, 1st century AD, with all the blood marks and the images of a crucifixion that takes a place remarkably like that of Jesus. Okay, let's get to the real stuff here. What happened to this man, and just quickly get to the resurrection evidence that's placed in it. First of all, the bloodstains. What are they like? The bloodstains are AB positive. There's real hemoglobin in this blood. This is not dye. This is not paint. This is real blood with a blood type, a partial DNA profile, hemoglobin, and in fact it acts like blood. We can tell that the body had been vertically placed like on a cross because, of course, we can see how the blood is flowing down and how the center of gravity of the blood actually flows toward the bottom. It's very, very clear that the person was vertically elevated. It's very clear he had AB positive blood type. Interesting too, by the way, is that in all the recent scientifically validated Eucharistic miracles, guess what the blood type is? Even for the Eucharistic miracle that Pope Francis oversaw in Buenos Aires in 1998. AB positive, exactly. So, of course, very interesting. And, of course, what does this say about what happened to the man? The man was severely beaten. He was crowned with thorns, and these thorns were huge, and they covered not only the sides of the head, as we see in medieval renditions and paintings of it, but also the top of the head. And it's just pushed into his head to make sure that it penetrates into the skull. This man was absolutely tormented. He was whipped multiple times. By what kind of whip? a Roman whip that had 3 strands with bone chips and metal fragments at the end of the whip. We can tell he was tormented by this whipping. The man has a spear hole right between the 4th and 5th ribs, going up at a 45-degree angle. And the spear hole that's there can be matched with medical forensics to show that it resembles the spearhead of a Roman legionnaire's pilum. A Roman legionnaire's pilum, used by the spear used by the Roman legionnaires in the 1st century. And of course, it goes right up between the 4th and the 5th ribs at a 45-degree angle, goes right into the pericardial sac, which has, a transparent fluid in it, and then goes right up into the heart, bleeding out this transparent fluid, which John thinks is water, and of course, blood from the heart. And what crucifixion has a man that's going to be penetrated with a spear to put him out of his misery? What crucifixion has a crowning of thorns? What crucifixion? Well, there are some crucifixions where a person is nailed to the cross, but by and large, criminals were tied to the cross to prolong their death and their torment. In the case of Jesus or other criminals, they wanted to nail him, so they put the nails right through the man's wrist instead of through the middle of the hand, right? Because the middle of the hand, the flesh would have torn through. They put it right through his wrist and right through the ankle bones so that he'll be attached to the cross. And every single time he tries to breathe and elevate himself, he's going to get shocked by all those nerves in his hands and in his ankles. The Romans were master torturers, and they tortured this man in exactly the way that the gospel accounts say, the very unique and unusual crucifixion of Jesus in the history of crucifixions. But there's more. This image, let's take a look at how it was formed. It actually has very interesting relic of the resurrection in glory. Let's see why that is. How was this image formed? The image, as I said before, is a perfect 3-dimensional photographic negative image on a non-photographically sensitive cloth. And just keep that in mind. Notice, too, that the image is on the very uppermost surface of the fibrils. So it's on the very, very surface of the fibrils, but it never penetrates to the medulla of the fiber, and it never penetrates to the middle of the cloth. So it's just on the very, very, very surface of the fibrils there. And so if you look at that, it's the most unique history in the history of images. We have no other image like it, none. And the reason is because it's sitting there on the very uppermost surface of the fibrils. What did this mean to physicists and thermochemists? It means the following. It could never have been produced by a liquid, like a paint or a dye. Because if that were the case, or even an aloe, or a rub, or anything else, because if you use anything that was liquid, or anything, that could actually, penetrate the cloth, it would have gone right to the medulla of the fibers, right to the middle of the cloth, and spangled. That clearly does not happen. This image is like super precise, super precise. Second thing, it couldn't have been vapors. Vapors, right? So if the body heated up, right, and there were aloes on the surface of the body, right, on the skin, and maybe the aloes, the vapor from the aloes came up into the skin, maybe that did it. That won't do it, because if it were produced by a vapor, again it would have gone into the medulla of the fiber and into the middle of the cloth, and of course the image would have been very vague. It would have been, right, vapors, spread out, right, and so of course it would not have been, and we've tested this again and again and again. There's just no way it could be produced by a vapor. Could it have been produced by scorching? No, it couldn't be produced by scorching, because scorching is very easily detectable by fluorescing it, right? And if you fluoresce the image, you can, a scorch will fluoresce very, very brightly, but the rest of the cloth would not. And of course here, there's no fluorescing at all, so we know it wasn't produced by a scorch. Furthermore, a scorch would penetrate to the medulla of the fiber anyway. So we're stuck, seemingly. What produced the image on the Shroud of Turin? There's only one other possible cause left. Light, you guys. It's going to have to be an exceedingly bright light. Now, this exceedingly bright light, as I'll say in a moment, will have to be in the magnitude of 6 to 8 billion watts. Why would it have to be 6 to 8 billion watts? Because it's a non-photographically sensitive cloth. And in order to get that much precision, and this is very precise, on this non-photographically sensitive cloth, you're going to need somewhere in the order of 6 to 8 billion watts of light energy. Now, you tell me how a dead body is going to produce 6 to 8 billion watts of light energy. Do you know what that's like? That's like taking 6 to 8 million searchlights at 1,000 watts per searchlight and focusing all of that right onto this 14-foot cloth. Now, if you know physics, you know that every time there's light, there's also heat, because, right, heat and light are vibratory activity that accompany one another. So we're going to have a very special light here. We can't have light that is going to be accompanied by heat. So there's only one possibility for that we can test, and that is you're going to have what's called vacuum ultraviolet radiation that can last for only 1/40 billionth of a second. Only 1/40 billionth of a second. Are you with me? That's a real short pulse of light. Or you're going to have light, otherwise, by the way, if it lasts even a smidge longer than 1/40 billionth of a second, the cloth gets snuffed and there's not even smoke left. Even the smoke vaporizes. We're talking about that much light. It's like, you're going to hang out, a million miles from the sun. Good luck, right? I mean, it's going to fry you and everything around you, right? The flares will just reach out and kill you. But that's what's coming out of this dead body. So, of course, we've tried to explain this by any form of natural causation. Either the light had no accompanying heat energy, in which case it's supernatural light. It's not a physical force of light, right? It's supernatural light. Or that burst was only 1/40 billionth of a second or shorter. Now, I don't know how you're going to explain it, but we finally were able to replicate it in 2010 in a laboratory. Dr. Paolo Di Lazzaro and his teams actually replicated this by using excimer ARF lasers. And the excimer ARF lasers is a really very precise vacuum ultraviolet radiation source. And it would take 14,000 excimer ARF lasers, more than the entire capacity of lasers in the entire world, to be emanated from that body in order to produce that amount of light for 1/40 billionth of a second. How do dead bodies do this? Not naturally, only supernaturally. Here's Di Lazzaro's conclusion.
The ultraviolet light necessary to form the image exceeds the maximum power released by all ultraviolet light sources available today. It would require pulses having durations shorter than 1/40 billionth of a second and intensities on the order of several billion watts.
There you go. I think we're looking at a supernatural cause. Either that's a supernatural light, or it is dead bodies just don't produce 6 to 8 billion watts of light energy. They just don't, not from any natural cause. But there's more. This body had to become mechanically transparent. The body had to be spiritual. It has to be spiritualized. Remember St. Paul when he talks about this, that we're going to be transformed, right, in power and in glory and in spirit. And why? Because the risen Christ was transformed in power and glory and spirit. And now we're looking right at this. It's going to be a pneumatikon soma, he says. It's going to be a spiritual body, from a natural body to a spiritual body. And we see the gospel, the gospel accounts that all point to a spiritual body. They thought he was seeing a ghost. Or, of course, in Matthew's gospel, they all bow down in worship, etc. So we know there's significant evidence for the testimony that the apostles saw Jesus transformed in divinity, transformed in glory, transformed in power. They're bowing down and worshiping. They're scared to death. They think they're seeing a super ghost, right? They're seeing the spiritual presence. Paul thinks the same thing, right, as a pneumatikon soma. So how do we know this? Recall that the Shroud of Turin has not only a two-dimensional image that would come from a flat surface of the body, it also has a three-dimensional image. You can actually see the bones inside the body in direct proportion to the actual surface of the skin on the surface. You can see the bones inside of the hands, the tendons, the sinews, in relationship to the flesh surrounding the hands. The cloth has to penetrate the body. The cloth has to move into the body to take that photograph, as it were, of the inside of the body, which means that the body has to become spiritual. It has to become, in physics, mechanically transparent, and light has to be emanating from every three-dimensional point in the body. If that's the case, ladies and gentlemen, we have a second supernatural causation. Dead bodies normally don't become mechanically transparent and emanate light from every three-dimensional point inside them, as well as emanating light from the surface. This just doesn't happen. Poor old physicist John Jackson finally looks on the whole thing and goes, look, I'm a physicist. I like natural causations. But there isn't one. It seems to me that the best explanation for how this body was able to do this and put this image on this non-photographically sensitive linen cloth, very simply, was what the Gospels reported. He rose in glory, he rose in power, he rose in spirit. And in 1/40 of a second, or through some form of supernatural light, as the cloth penetrated that body, he went right through it and left us a relic of the resurrection which we are going to inherit. It's almost as if God said, truly. And I'll just conclude. It's almost as if God, left this behind, thinking to himself, 20 centuries later, these scientists are going to find this thing and they're going to look at it and go, how is this possible to give a natural explanation to? Oh my gosh, we have a supernatural relic and evidence for the resurrection of the Son. And God will wink and go, gotcha. Thank you very, very much, everybody. Thank you.